There's a lot of theorizing about the NVIDIA adapter problem, which, to be clear, is not the only 12-volt high power thing that exists. There's 12-volt high power native, which we've talked about in the past, and there's 12-volt high power adapted. So there's a lot of theorizing, just not a lot of practical testing. And the reason is because it's really hard. We finally bought a proper thermal imaging setup to test the RTX 4090 adapter fires or melting following headlines that have been popping off since a couple initial Reddit posts went viral, and it's been basically every day since then. We wanted to be accurate and cover this properly, so we crammed about 40 hours of testing into 48 hours of real time. And we're aware that Jay and Igor have done a number of videos and articles about this, but our findings thus far on this developing issue differ from Igor's in a few key ways, and they may lead to a more nuanced conclusion if we can get to a conclusion. We really put some time in to carefully try and recreate the burned up scenarios from the internet, but we still ran through it as fast as we could. And unfortunately for me, I had already scheduled the team to have some bonus time off after the onslaught of reviews, so you are left with my unsupervised editing and my testing. But this will be a fun one, so let's get started. Before that, we brought you this video on store.gamersnexus.net. Our brand new thermal camera that we're using for this testing was purchased with money from our viewers who recently bought our coaster packs, and you should grab a pack as well. These unique 3D coaster packs include 4 designs each, and all of them resemble PC components, and they're carefully molded to support your drinks, but also look awesome. They have a great texture, they have detailed component layout like 7-segment displays, power and reset buttons, heat sinks, and we even went down to the heat pipe level to get it carefully shaped so that it matches a real heat pipe. The money that you all spend on store.gamersnexus.net goes straight back into the company as we invest in new equipment, and also we're trying to figure out how to buy sleep, but we haven't sorted it out yet. Once we do though, we'll probably use some of the money for that, because this took a long time. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab a pack and help us out directly. So first things first, we're gonna need some of your cables, because we've been running a lot of them through this setup for the last few days, and we've been through 3 different video cards. There's card number 2, there's card number 3, and multiple different cables, and we're gonna have information on where you can send yours if they're damaged in the description and in this video. So as of right now, the current theories for what caused this cable to burn up haven't been tested. Just as a reminder, although Igor has published quite a few comments on it, and what he mainly did was tear apart the connector to see what's inside. We wanted to tear it apart and test the theories. As of this filming, Igor's lab's findings have gotten widespread, but also, again, as of this filming, Igor himself didn't actually produce a failure on that cable. Jay's title then said that, quote, Igor found the problem. But with the additional context of our testing, that title doesn't seem 100% accurate. And to be clear, that's not a slight on Jay, it's just saying that as more people dig into this, it appears that the issue is more complicated. Jay attempted to reproduce the problem, but had no immediate results. And the issue identified in Igor's findings may be part of the problem or a different one, but we don't think it is the problem. We think it's an indicator or maybe a red herring of a wider issue at large, and that's why we're doing the practical testing today. So this is the test setup. There's a time and a place for thermal imaging, and this is it. However, we're also using thermocouples, or physical probes, that are wired to the 12-volt lines that connect to the header that's on the cart. So we're looking at it both internal and external temperatures, which means we have the internal metal temperature going into the plastic housing, and we have the external plastic housing temperature. Because when you look at melted plastics, you need to know what the temperature was at the point of origin for the melting, not just the exterior. This camera is actually sufficient for most of the testing though, because the majority of our tests will be with the housing and the strain relief on the cable removed in order to test Igor's theory. That means that the camera is pointed actually straight at the metal and the plastic, and that includes the solder points for the 12-volt lines directly. It is exactly the perfect use case for a thermal camera, and we're excited to start using it. The probes are helpful for validating the delta between internal and external when the cables are still stock and sealed with plastic and the strain relief. So this is the Fluke RSE 600. We just purchased it for rapid cable testing, and thanks to the community's support on the store and especially Patreon, sometimes we can buy stuff like this last minute and really dedicate to learning how to use it for a content piece. Currently, you're seeing the system on a test bench, and this was our worst case scenario overload testing. We know that a lot of you also wanted to see it tested in a case, so we did some of those tests as well, but at the end of the day, the conclusion was the same. This is one of the cables that we opened. Well, actually, not literally this one, because you can see it's still assembled and functional, but this is. And what we found inside was pretty interesting. We opened these extremely carefully and were able to do so without damaging them, unlike the cable that Igor and some other media outlets showed. That means, to our benefit here, we can actually still use this cable reliably to test theories in a practical environment, knowing that we didn't cause undue damage that could affect the results. We just removed the strain relief, which is massive, mind you, and then we peeled back some layers of the cable. Now, there were a couple of really key differences between our cable here and the one that Igor's lab opened. Critically, the wire rating on his 12-volt and ground lines is 150 volts in this photo from Igor's lab. However, in the 5 NVIDIA adapters that we opened up, every single one of them has 300-volt lines rated for the 12-volt and ground connections at 105 degrees Celsius for the rating. Ours are rated to a higher standard than what Igor showed. So there's a question here as to what's happening to lead to a 150-volt rated cable in someone else's connector. We spoke with NVIDIA, and the company isn't ready to release any kind of statement yet, and it's still investigating. So there's no official information yet. We also spoke with some partners and manufacturers, and our understanding is that they're all supposed to be like the one we have, or actually the 5 that we have, using 300 volts at 105C rated wires for 12 volts and ground. Now, there are lower rated wires in the adapters, but those are for the sense lines. There's maximally 4 of them. They're not always in use though. And those ones might read 150 volts, but they're much thinner and they're not used for power delivery, so different story. Now, a lot of Igor's theory is based on this next part. He and Be Quiet cut open an adapter cable, and after basically saying YouTubers are dumb idiots, I thought it was funny actually. He then explained that, quote, "but just carefully lifting off the enveloping layer causes the thin plate to tear immediately. That, quote, is important because ours doesn't match." He continued and said, "with which we can also see that bending the cables at the connector and the housing can cause such damage. Loose contacts or unsafe bridges, as well as increased resistance as a result of such actions, are extremely dangerous at these current levels and very quickly lead to the errors that we've already seen. And you can now also see why the 2 outer contacts of the connector are particularly affected. The charge socket on the card is only consequential damage." Now, based on the 5 cables that we have, we entirely disagree with Igor's analysis here. His analysis might be accurate for that cable, but we think it's a red herring, or it's inaccurate to say that all of the cables would easily bend and easily have the outer pins snap off, because for ours, that's absolutely not the case. Not only does the strain relief basically stop that, but also internally, ours is built differently. It has fewer contact points that are stronger and use more solder across them, whereas his, well, we'll show you some diagrams in a moment. So we think his issue he's seeing here might be a red herring to the actual issue, whatever that may be, but so far our findings don't match that. They're different cables for some reason. If, in the worst case, the 2 outer lines break off, the entire current flows in the middle via the remaining 2 lines and is only then distributed again in the plug. But this foil is also thin and doesn't replace a real 14 gauge. So it certainly doesn't have to be explained that it gets really hot. Now, to demonstrate the claim of fragility, Igor cut apart the ground side of the cable and demonstrated it. We'll have to just sort of take his word and assume that the 12-volt side looks the same way. Now, the 12-volt side is the one where we're seeing most of the damage in photos on Reddit. It's actually typically in what it would be the innermost pin on the sense side, or 12-volt side, that is shown damaged in photos, although some of them are the far rightmost, outermost pin, but you need to look at if it's sense side or ground side, and then also if this is related to contact, or how well the housing is socketed, the connector is socketed into the housing. That could be an indicator as to why the melting happens on one side or the other if it's not fully seated, but we'll come back to that. So in addition to Igor's wire quality being different from ours, we also noticed differences in the soldering method. The cable's apparent thin, weak construction at the solder points and the bus bar is central to Igor's theory, but ours don't match that. And to be very clear, because everyone likes drama, that doesn't mean Igor is wrong. It means Igor has a different cable than us, which is why we're asking for cable photos from you all, because we'd like to know how that happens. So we decided to map the two cables, or specifically Patrick on our team made these diagrams with adept paint.net skills. You can see that Igor's cable has the leftmost and rightmost wires contacting at a single plate, with the two central contacting at 2 plates each. Our unit, however, looks like this. All 8 of our cables are strongly bridged with solder in pairs at just 2 plates on each side, which then feed the bus bar as sort of a catch-all. This is really important because a lot of the claim of fragility is based on those outermost wires being easy to snap for an end user. Now, we tested this theory with one of our cables where we just created a worst case scenario. We snapped off 2 sides, just like Igor was explaining, and then we tried to thermally torture it to see if it would start melting once it loses contact. We're not sure if Igor's cable is just made wrong or from an unauthorized supplier, or if the supplier mixed up the supply and built it incorrectly, basically a manufacturing defect. But in any case, none of ours match, so we can't recreate it perfectly per his reporting because we just don't have a cable that's rated that way, or actually even built that way. Now, in reality, because ours appear to be built differently into a higher standard, again, all 5 of ours here, it is basically impossible or unreasonable that a user would ever cause strain damage on at least our types of cables. That doesn't mean the adapters are all cleared and safe. Clearly, some of them are burning up. Maybe they're different quality. That's what we're trying to get to the bottom of. But for ours, you would have to not only bend past the strain relief, but you would also have to bend in such a way that the much stronger solder at the more limited points of contact would break free. We tried it, we weren't able to recreate that particular type of failure. That leaves maybe manufacturing issues, but for our cables, we're not really seeing how that theory could apply. And this is where we could really use your help, because we need a higher volume of products to look at this point than we have here in the lab. So a couple things. First of all, the email address is 4090cable@gamersnexus.net. That is a dedicated inbox for this event. We'll close it once we're done sort of reporting on everything. And what we need to know is a few things. One, if you have a 4090 and you want to keep your cable, you're not willing to part with it, we could still use your help. What we'd like you to do is peel back the tape on the cable. So there's some tape on the housing of the cable. And then, that, by the way, you can save that, stick it to somewhere not fully, put it back on later. And that's just a seal. Then you can pull back, without damaging it, the sleeving on the wire. This will not cause any damage. If you feel like it's going to cause damage, you're doing it wrong, you need to stop and reevaluate. So once you pull back the sleeving, you'll see some numbers on the cable. And really what we want to know is, you can follow the template we're going to put on the screen. And what we want to know is, what is the rating of the cables that you have in yours? You can send a photo of it. That would be ideal, actually. We'd prefer that. Or you can just type it to us. For the subject, we needed to follow the format on the screen so we can rapidly filter these. So if yours says 150, then put 150V in the subject. And if yours is 300, put 300V in the subject. Just put that right at the front. That's the first thing that should be in the subject. The rest can be related to the card model itself. If you have one that is rated differently than 300 volts at 105C, we also need to know where you got it. So that would be the board partner, if it is a board partner model, and also it'd help to know what country or region you were in. And then finally on this point, maybe more importantly, if you have one that has even started to melt, please email us right away. Again, we'll put the sort of formatting on the screen here, and let us know how we can buy that cable off of you. We just want the cable. If you want to dump the whole card, I guess we'd buy the whole thing at retail price, but we're only going to buy so many of those, they're expensive. So we're happy to give you retail price with the receipt of purchase and basically buy it off of you. We'll look at the receptacle side and the cable side, but we do need some actually melted cables. More damage is more better, to start to rip them apart and analyze internally, carefully, and forensically what's going on as we look at the theories we're about to get into. Just the soldering and contact patch differences are pretty major and seem to indicate more of a process difference than just purely a supply difference like you'd have in a wire. Now, regardless of all this, we set forth to test this and try and recreate the issues in as level-headed a way as possible, because there's a lot of hyperbole and a lot of headlines and Reddit posts right now, and it's not really helpful in identifying the true root cause. So the testing evaluates a stock scenario with the sealed original cable. We also look at a worst case scenario with 2 pins isolated from the others, and we even use a liquid-cooled card for an absolute worst case scenario with a damaged cable without any airflow over the connector whatsoever. Further, we tested on an RTX 4090 Fe, an ASUS Strix, and that liquid Neptune we mentioned with both stock and overclocked benchmarks. So we pushed upwards of 600 watts plus, actually. So this was a complicated test matrix that took 2 non-stop days to finish, and I would like to go home now, but we're gonna finish the video first. Okay, here's the test matrix. I originally voiced this and it took 5 minutes, so we're gonna do the fast version. We tested 3 cards. We tested them stock and overclocked, so that's 6 combinations. We then tested 4 combinations of cable. One was full stock unmodified. One had 2 cables cut and 2 poor contact patches. One had no cables cut but poor contact only. And then the last one was 1 cable cut and 1 with poor contact uncut. Part of the theories that have emerged suggested that it may be loose or limited contact, not a total lack of contact. So that would mean that the part at the foil where the cable comes in and contacts solder is now separated from the rest of the contacts. However, the cable itself is still connected and continuous down into the bus bar. So we stuck it into the housing in a way that it was foil to bus bar and in near proximity to the next foil contact plate, but without directly and fully contacting it. In theory, this could cause melting. And that's because of resistance buildup that would cause additional heat load. But it's really hard to precisely position it once it's snapped so that it contacts just enough to cause a problem, but not so much that it's working as it would stock, and not so little that maybe a problem develops somewhere else. So we only did this one on the Neptune, and just in short, it did not create any problems. It probably would, but we weren't able to engineer the problem. It would require a really unique failure or a lot more time invested in trying to create the issue. So that's somewhere around 24 total combinations, and then you have to factor in that we reran the ASUS Strix because if you point the thermal camera at the backside, you're actually looking at the ground side. So we also looked at it from the 12-volt side just to be safe. We're gonna get to the charts in a second, but the worst case scenario we tested was an 8-hour load with a damaged cable, and it was a non-stop 100% load on the GPU, or 99% with rounding errors, and it didn't fail. So actually the hottest thing in one of the worst case tests was the 8-pin side, but we're using an EVGA titanium T2, which is a very expensive power supply, so those cables are fine. First, for the internal versus external deltas, here's what we observed. The thermal camera was within 5 to 6 degrees of the hottest thermocouple when testing the modified cable, or 1 to 2 degrees on the cooler of the 3 thermocouples. There are 2 that were running cooler. That's because we're still seeing the metal contact, so there's good conductivity, and because we've completely removed the housing, so there's no barrier or insulation to seeing the inside. At the worst of it, at 600-ish watts, we noticed about an 8 degrees Celsius delta between the hottest pin and the hottest spot on the IR image. Against the other 2 pins, that delta was about 4 to 5 degrees. And you'll see the biggest deltas, generally speaking, on the undamaged cable because it still has all the housing there to insulate it. Now, we only performed this wiring on the Neptune because any physical measurement will affect the results. For these tests, we insulated the thermocouples very lightly with Kapton tape, so we didn't send power down a thermocouple or introduce unwanted resistance or other consequences. We also had to use adhesive to hold them in place. This is standard practice to the extent that you can actually find white papers from NASA and Intel about doing it this way. Now, the relatively small delta here between the external and internal temperatures is really good news for testing because it's very hard to wire those thermocouples, and IR is much faster, and for this type of thing it makes sense. So we can kind of add that delta in as a rough approximation in the other tests. There are some caveats here with airflow influence on the connector housing externally and cooling it down on cards where there is airflow there, not the Neptune. But that gives us a general range for the delta. So we'll start our adapter test with the Neptune liquid-cooled card, as this one is wired and it also lacks airflow. And it can also run closer to 600 watts, so it's a worst case scenario. Our labeling is simple, although the pinout technically has numbering, we're using our own here. Overclocking increased the thermals by a couple degrees in all scenarios, jumping about 3 to 4 degrees maximally on the uncut stock cable. 71.8 degrees Celsius internal and 63.6 degrees external was our hottest measurement unmodified. Snapping the cable at the 2 points that Igor recommended resulted in a marginally higher reading on all 3 pins and an IR, but not beyond the stock OC numbers, the unmodified OC. Overclocked and snapped, we climbed to 74.4 degrees internal or 68.2 external, so it is actually influencing the results. Partially repairing pin 1, the cable itself, but leaving it in poor contact, similar to one of Igor's theories, resulted in roughly the same thermals as the full stock cable, because now we only have one that's completely damaged. Each of these tests was allowed to run until it hit steady state, at which we collected the values. The longest of the tests was, again, about 8 hours, and its results were the same at 8 hours as they were at 30 minutes, with no damage starting to show. Now, because this is about plastics and melting, it's possible that the actual temperature readings you're seeing won't change in that time from steady state till really close to point of failure. Theoretically, in that case, at 8 hours, we didn't see any damage. It's kind of like how long do we have to run this before it gets unreasonable for GN to find the fault? And the answer is more than 8 hours, because we have other stuff to do and we're way behind on this piece already. Sorry. Purely objectively speaking, we weren't able to recreate the type of failure that Igor described or theorized in his post, because remember, at least as of right now when I'm filming this, he hasn't made it melt. He just sort of took it apart and then said this is why it might melt, which is valid, but we weren't able to recreate that scenario. So we don't believe it's the primary reason for the failures that you're seeing pop up online. There's another reason. This chart shows the thermals of the same 2 primary tests on the Strix and the FE cards instead. We routinely saw higher temperatures on the damaged cable than on the stock one, which again makes sense because we're forcing all the power through less metal. The maximum range was about 8 degrees difference between the damaged and undamaged cables, with the hottest result at 68.5 degrees Celsius external. Assuming our previous numbers apply here, that'd put us at about maybe say 76 internal on the hottest pin. We haven't ever done thermal testing on cable, so none of this really means anything without some context. We threw a 3090 Ti with its included EVGA 12 pin onto the bench, and we tested that with IR. For that, we saw a 54.5 to 55 degree result on average for overclocked, or 107% power target, and then we saw about a 52, 51 degree result when it was full stock. And that's not too far off from the 4090's results, considering that this has a lower power consumption. As for the 8 pins, the hottest we've ever seen those is about 60 degrees Celsius, and that was when we were pulling a lot of power through them for overclock testing. And this is where we come to some important reminders, which is that we try to only report on what we can see or test for objectively. Obviously, there's subjectivity and judgments and things like that in some of our content pieces and product reviews and consumer reports, but in this instance, it is a technical objective matter, and we can't figure out how to engineer the problem. So another thing to remember is that on the FE card, we had about 60 hours of testing on FE cards now, on 2 different ones, and that was for the review process of the GPUs plus the review process of the CPUs, where we reran these cards through with a select set of games for CPU testing on multiple CPUs. So at most, you're looking at maybe 8 hours continuous load. We've done a different scenario, but we've done overclocking streams 4 hours long with liquid nitrogen, so that cools things a little bit, maybe not valid. But in normal use, with the adapter cable, we've got dozens of hours on them, and they haven't failed yet. That does not mean that they cannot or will not fail. It means that we probably got one that's not going to fail, or it's going to require some ridiculous scenario. And that's the problem. If this is an issue where not every connector will reliably fail, we're not going to be able to reliably create a failure until we get one of the bad adapters. And the main reason we try to avoid theorycraft, frankly speaking, is because I don't think I'm smart enough to theorycraft things that require either a lot of mathematical or really specific engineering background or electrical background. What we're good at is technician type work or test engineering type work, and that's where we try to sort of create the failures in a practical sense. But we couldn't here. Obviously, there is a problem with cables burning. You can see it online nearly daily at this point from early adopters. That's indisputable. We don't know how many are failing or what percentage of buyers have a failed cable, but so far we know enough to at least say, yes, this is a real problem, and it's on at least some connectors. At the same time, it's probably not on all connectors based on the testing we've done. Ultimately, adapters are always going to be the weakest link in an electrical chain. That's just how they work. This is probably selling a whole lot of PCIe Gen 5 native power supplies right now, things that have just 12 pins coming straight out of the power supply, because it is the safest shot guarantee you're probably not going to have a problem because you've eliminated the adapter. And just objectively speaking, adapters always introduce another layer of complexity, and that layer is one that could potentially be the weakest link. It may not fail, but that's how it is. At the same time, don't be surprised in the future if you see some native 12 pins failing the same way, because if they use the same problematic solution that whatever these failed cables are using, then they will also have the same issues if it's not an issue of being an adapter, but rather a problem of how the connector is mating at the housing, for example. We don't know yet. With regard to Igor's theory, our cable was nowhere close to the assembly quality of his, so it's not accurate to say that he has identified, quote, the problem. He identified a problem. So far, one that seems to be unique to his reporting, but it's not representative of all adapters, as none of our 5 have either of those 2 problems, which is a different wire spec, which he didn't note because he probably didn't have the other one, and the assembly quality. We're also aware of several other theories. So the testing we've done already took several days, and we weren't able to get one to fail, but it's possible that a different condition would get one to fail, even if we have a so-called good one. Buildzoid, for example, has a theory about a pin contact area and the double gap between them within the housing. There may be something to that. And there's another theory kind of related to that the design of the 12 pin causes enough friction that it creates a less audible or feelable snap when you connect the cable into the card. And the result of that could be that people are potentially not socketing the cable all the way. Now, this isn't necessarily user error if the design is so stupid that most users make an error, to be very clear on that. So if you have something that's not fully socketed and the bias of the cables tends to be into the case, the central area where you're going to run everything down the center channel to cable route it, so you're pulling the cable sort of this way on average, then perhaps that would explain why we typically see a failure on the inside of the card towards the back of the case, because it's the one that's getting the most strain and potentially exaggerating a loose connection or maybe even slightly pulling away from the socket. Now that is one that we tried to recreate. The problem is there's a very fine line between unbootable and not connected properly, and bootable and not connected properly. And that bootable but not connected properly is what we would need in order to test it. And we just weren't able to reliably create that. Definitely that theory has merit, but it's hard to, look, we're in this deep, like days already at this point. At the start of the script, I said something like 48 hours. It's actually closer to 72 now. My team's been gone for like 3 days. So this is a lot of commitment already. And what we need at this point is cables that have failed. So we want to test more of these theories. It just doesn't make sense to commit to it until we can actually rip one apart carefully and do some forensics on it to see where did it actually start melting internally and after we peel back all the layers. So follow those instructions from earlier. They're also linked below, or at least timestamps below, to help us get one of these or a couple of these cables so we can maybe do some additional testing. And that's going to be it. We'd love to have an answer for you as to why specifically they've failed, but we don't have that. We can say maybe why they haven't failed, or that some of the prevailing theories are not necessarily the reason for the failure. And that took all of this work to do just that. So I don't have a firm conclusion, which is weird. We're going to have to revisit this once we get some more in. But at least we've done some in-depth looks at it. And the coolest thing that we've gotten out of it is internal versus external deltas for the 2 methods of thermal probing, because that's going to be really useful for us. So as for us, well, we've already used multiple 4090s with the adapter for a couple weeks at this point, and they haven't failed. We're going to keep using those, and maybe one will, or more realistically, we think they probably won't. Because if this is a manufacturing defect issue or a supply issue, then it just doesn't seem to be one that has affected the units we got. And that's sort of the problem with manufacturing defects or variable supply. It doesn't affect all of them. So we're going to keep using ours. But hopefully we'll have more for you soon. Might be worth looking at the cable after you've run it for a few weeks and see if there's any damage forming, though. We'll keep you posted. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to support in-depth testing and reporting like this and our purchases of awesome utilities like our new thermal camera. The camera needs a name. Post a name for the thermal camera in the comments. I won't accept Camera McCamera Face, but maybe you'll vote for something that can be in the headlines. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.